what difference does it make to Labour's chances, or Sir Keir Starmer's chances of becoming Prime Minister? The answer to that question is probably approximately zero, because irrespective of whether Scotland elects SNP or Labour MPs, neither of them is going to be willing to help to sustain a minority Conservative administration. Where, however, it does potentially make a difference is to Labour's chances of getting an overall majority and therefore being able to find government at least a little more comfortable than it otherwise would be the case. This result is, in a sense, in stark contrast with virtually everything we have seen in Scotland since the 2014 independence referendum. You'll remember shortly after that, in the 2015 general election, Labour was down to one seat, what it's still at, and its former domination of representation in Scotland disappeared. Now, in this by-election, we get the Labour Party not only getting a 20% swing, a swing that, if it were to occur across Scotland as a whole, and of course it may not necessarily, would see Labour back up to the 40 seats or so that it used to take for granted in Scotland, but also the 58, 59% that Labour secured in Rutherglen is almost as high as it got in that constituency back in 2010. So certainly I think we have to conclude that although by-elections often exacerbate the swing against the government, it may well be the case that many a voter was protesting both against the SNP government at Holyrood and the Conservative government at Westminster in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have done to the same degree in a general election. But I think we have now to say that the message of the opinion polls in recent weeks and months that Labour pose a serious challenge to the SNP's current level of representation of Westminster, that is now very, very clearly the case.
And the interesting thing, Patrick, is as a reminder as well that although people say, oh, the Conservatives don't have any place in Scotland, if you look back, in this seat, the Conservatives did much better in like 2017, and that Conservative vote has collapsed, and actually that sort of union get the SNP out vote, unionist SNP get the SNP out vote, has all gone to Labour. You can sort of see the sort of U-shaped graph, if you like, of what's happened to the Labour support.
Exactly. Indeed, even in 2019, the Conservatives won about 12% of the vote in Rutherglen and Hamilton West. Compare that to last night when they lost their deposit. Now, clearly, Labour would have won without tactical votes from the Conservatives, so large was their majority. But equally, it's hugely significant that Conservative voters in this case, and indeed maybe in other cases in the West and Central Belt of Scotland, where SNP majorities could be overturned by tactical voting, it's hugely significant that Conservative voters have chosen in such numbers either to stay at home or indeed back the Labour candidate.
I know you've been.
Can I make two caveats to that, though,
yeah,
Patrick?
absolutely, John.
I mean, caveat number one is that in a by-election, Conservative voters could vote for the Labour candidate without any fear that in so doing, they might be enabling Labour to get into government. So it's easier for voters to vote tactically in the context of the by-election. The second thing to say is, look, the Conservative Party in Scotland is suffering from Partygate and the Liz Truss fiscal event as much as the party is south of the border. The party is 9 points down in the opinion polls in Scotland. The fact that its vote is down by 11 points in Rutherglen is therefore, to that extent, not a surprise. The Conservative Party in Scotland is in trouble because the Conservative Party across the United Kingdom as a whole is in deep trouble.
John, just take us through the what's happening to the SNP vote, because again, it's astonishing that they've gone from riding so high. I mean, clearly, since then they've had a change of leader, and Humza Yousaf isn't going down as well, and all of the allegations around party funding and the police investigation and so on. Is this a sign that actually the SNP have sort of turned a corner, which is going to be difficult to come back from?
Well, it's not going to be easy to come back from, but that doesn't necessarily mean to say it's impossible. I mean, the opinion polls on average show Labour, the SNP support down by 8 points as compared with 2019. But of course, in this by-election, its vote is down by 16 points. I mean, the reason why we're all slightly shocked and surprised this morning is not because Labour won the by-election. It's the scale of Labour's success is much greater than was expected. So it is very, very clear. As I was saying earlier, Labour now pose a serious chance to the SNP. Now, if you track the history of the decline in SNP support during the course of this year, it's pretty clear that the decisive event is not the difficulties about the allegations about the party's finances. Yes, after the arrest, but then subsequent release of Nicola Sturgeon, there was a bit of hit on the SNP, but the party support primarily declined during the leadership contest. And that's a leadership contest that has left the SNP with a leader who is markedly less popular than his predecessor, and which exposed divisions that already had begun to emerge during the gender recognition row. Divisions within the party over the economic management of Scotland, over the interests of urban versus rural Scotland, and over the coalition with the Greens in which the SNP is currently occupied. And those divisions have been noticed by voters. The proportion of people who think that the SNP isn't divided has gone up, isn't united, has gone up from around a third in October of last year to over 50% now. And voters, frankly, tend not to vote for divided parties. The difficulty, of course, facing Mr. Youssef, given the backdrop of the finances, and given the internal arguments still within the party about how it should fight the next general election and how far should it foreground independence, is does he, as somebody who only won the leadership narrowly, does he have the authority to unite his party? Can he provide his party with the inspiration it needs in order to get a clear path as to how it's going to fight? It's around that I think there are doubts, and they are doubts that Mr. Youssef at least needs to try to dispel.
John, we should caveat, of course, that only 37% of the good people in Rutherglen and Hamilton West
that's not surprisingly low for a by-election, right? Look, I mean, every time a party does badly in a by-election, says, oh, look at the turnout, it's not terribly high. They can always say that because the turnout is nearly always not terribly high.
Fine. Very good. Patrick, what are Labour people telling you, and what have they done during this campaign to clearly take what was an expectation they might win and turn it into winning big? Was it deploying Sue Gray on the doorsteps?
Well, Sue Gray was indeed on the doorsteps yesterday. Quite a surreal sight to see a former civil servant, still less Sue Gray, holding a Labour leaflet in one of her first outings as Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff. Look, the best way to describe how the Labour Party see this, how the top of the Labour Party see this, is in fact with a quote from Donald Dewar, who listeners might remember was the first ever First Minister of Scotland, the father of devolution. In 1978, he won for Labour a by-election against the SNP in Glasgow Garskadden. And he said, after he won, against expectations, that it had changed the whole psychological mood of Scottish politics. There was a sense that the SNP was a sort of unstoppable juggernaut at that point. Jim Callaghan's government was in the doldrums. That is very much how the Labour Party see this. They now see themselves as competitive again. As for how this has happened, this is the culmination of about 2.5 years of work. One of Keir Starmer's little noticed but most significant acts in his first year of Labour leader was effectively to sack the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, a Corbynite called Richard Leonard. In the years since, Anas Sarwar, who's become very close indeed to Keir Starmer, has been installed as leader. And last year, he came down to London and said, look, the mood in the country is turning. If you give me the resources to target 10 to 20 seats, you will see returns. Keir Starmer's office were divided on that plan, but it won the support of Keir Starmer and his campaign director, Morgan McSweeney. And you're now seeing a well-resourced Scottish Labour Party, well-organised Scottish Labour Party. Significant, I think, that 65% of these votes were postal votes, which suggests Labour were very organised in getting their votes out. Lots of London activists bussed up and London staff bussed up. So it's a testament to how organised and well-drilled the machine the Labour Party has become.
Just finally to you, John, I mean, this if replicated, would suggest that Keir Starmer is on course to become Prime Minister, possibly with a decent, workable majority. It also suggests Scottish independence is dead, doesn't it?
Two things don't necessarily go together. Yes, progress in achieving Scottish independence, at least so far as holding referendum is concerned, is not going to go any further. But we should remember that although support for the SNP has fallen this year, support for independence has not. It's still running at 47, 48%. It's just that some yes supporters at the moment are willing to vote for the Labour Party.
Thanks so much for that. As Professor John Curtice. Patrick, just more broadly on reading your column today, looking ahead to the Labour Party conference. I mean, no better way to go into the party conference than with a big by-election win. So Keir Starmer will have a spring in his step. But as you point out in your column today, he's got quite a lot of work to do when he gets to Liverpool.
Yes, of course he does. The interesting thing about last week's Tory conference, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as people at the top of the Labour Party are concerned, is that this is a Conservative Party leadership, regardless of the wisdom of its strategy, that has an electoral strategy that you and I could explain in a sentence, whether or not we'd start sniggering at the end of that sentence. Can we really say the same of the Labour Party beyond we are not the Conservative Party, we are not this government, we're the only lever you have to pull to get this government out? Now, look, in first past the post elections, that's all you really need to be. But that doesn't mean that there are people at the top of the Labour Party who are getting a little bit nervous that they haven't yet sharpened their message, sharpened their strategy in response to this new, in their view, quite cynical Conservative way of doing business. And that is the challenge for the Labour Party, to respond to that new Tory approach and set out their own retail offer to the country in Liverpool next week.